The late afternoon sun hung low over the river, painting the water in streaks of molten gold and shadow. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, carrying with it a distant hum of cicadas and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. She had been walking along the narrow, winding path that followed the riverbank, her mind lost in the quiet rhythm of the woods, when the sound of footsteps behind her made her pulse tighten. At first she thought it was just another traveler, maybe a prospector heading back to camp, but the way the footsteps quickened and the subtle rustle of the underbrush told a different story. 3 figures emerged from the shadows between the trees. Their faces were half hidden under the brims of worn hats, their eyes sharp, calculating, the kind of eyes that measured someone as though she were a mark. She stopped, her heart thudding against her ribs, a cold shiver running down her spine. They didn't speak. There was no warning, no greeting, only the slow, deliberate step of men who had decided they owned the moment. The river's gentle murmur, which had been comforting minutes before, now seemed sinister, echoing like a drum in the tense silence. She could see the glint of knives in the fading light, and a familiar, terrible dread settled over her. She had heard stories of travelers and settlers who had come this way, of people who disappeared in the woods or were found miles downstream with no explanation. But those were tales she had brushed off until now. Now the threat was real, pressing in from 3 directions, leaving her trapped by the riverbank with nowhere to run. Her hands shook slightly, and her mind raced for any plan, any way to escape, but the men moved with a precision that left little hope for hesitation. The first man stepped closer, and she felt the danger in the air thick, it's almost tangible, as if the very trees around her were holding their breath. She forced herself to take a step back, trying to keep the river at her side. Something solid to cling to, but the ground was uneven and slick. Then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, a sound cut through the quiet, sharp, and sudden a low whistle. Almost a call carried on the wind, and from the shadows of the trees he appeared. He was a figure of the land itself, emerging from the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to every rock, every gust of wind. His presence alone shifted the air. The men froze, half turned toward him, sensing something they couldn't yet understand. He was tall and lean, with the strength of someone who had lived and survived in the wilderness all his life. His eyes were dark and alert, scanning the situation with a calmness that made the danger around him feel almost distant. There was no fear in his stance, only the poised readiness of a warrior who had faced death many times and understood it without trembling. The riverbank felt smaller now. The world condensed into the narrow space between the 3 men, the woman, and this unexpected protector. Her heart still raced, but there was a flicker of hope, a tiny flame in the oppressive shadow of fear. She could see the subtle movements, the way he positioned himself, how his hand hovered near the weapon at his side, not threatening yet but undeniably prepared. The men who had seemed so certain of their advantage moments ago hesitated, their confidence wavering in the face of this silent, imposing figure. The first man, trying to regain control of the situation, took a step forward, but the warrior's gaze held him, steady and unwavering. There was a tension in the air that could be felt in the stones underfoot and the branches trembling overhead. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with the weight of unspoken choices and the looming question of what would happen next. The woman's fingers curled into the fabric of her coat, knuckles white, as she realized she had become part of a story much larger than herself, a story written in survival, courage, and a confrontation that felt older than the forest itself. The 3 men exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their eyes. They had thought the river was the end of their hunt, the moment of power, but now there was a new player, shadow among shadows, and he moved with the certainty of the land itself. There was something elemental about him, something that spoke of long nights under the stars, of tracking and understanding the wilderness in ways that no ordinary man could. And in that understanding there was danger for him, for them, and for anyone who might underestimate what he was capable of. The woman's mind flashed to the stories she had heard of Apache warriors. Tales told around fires and whispered in towns of men who could move unseen, who could appear in a heartbeat and disappear just as quickly, who defended their own with unmatched skill and unshakable resolve. Could this man be one of them? It hardly mattered. What mattered was that he was here, and he was alone, and somehow, against all odds, he had appeared before the first blow could fall. A dry wind swept across the river, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from a distant campfire, and in that moment, everything felt suspended, poised on the edge of something irrevocable. The men's movements were cautious now, their earlier confidence replaced by the careful calculation of those who know they are outmatched but have not yet chosen to surrender. Every muscle in their bodies seemed tense, ready to act, yet uncertain of how. She could hardly breathe, caught between terror and awe. As the warriors shifted slightly, not a gesture of threat, but one of readiness. The river flowed beside her, indifferent to human conflict, its gentle current a stark contrast to the storm of tension on the bank. The light was fading fast, the forest darkening, and shadows began to stretch like long fingers reaching toward the scene. In that fading glow, everything was heightened, the sound of footsteps, the snap of twigs under cautious weight, the quickened pulse of her own heart. And then, in a moment so fragile, it could have been shattered by a single misstep, the first man made a move. A hand rose, a whisper of intent carried in the air, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause. The woman's breath caught in her throat, the river's murmur drowned out by the sudden pounding of her pulse. The warrior's eyes locked on the movement. The slightest shift in his stance sent a message without words. He was here, and no harm would come to her while he stood. But the riverbank held secrets, and danger is never so simple as a single protector against three men. The tension crackled, electric and unyielding, leaving everything unresolved. A story suspended on the knife edge of action. The woman realized, with a mixture of fear and relief, that her life in that instant was entwined with the choices of the warrior, and the outcome was as uncertain as the river's winding path through the forest. She could only watch, heart hammering as the moment stretched, waiting to see what would come next, and whether the shadows held salvation or peril. Time seemed to bend, and the river whispered promises of survival and peril alike. She knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And as the first man's hand hovered, as the warrior's gaze remained steady, and the forest itself held its breath, the story poised on the edge of the next heartbeat, she realized the impossible had arrived. And the danger was far from over. The forest seemed to lean in closer as the tension lingered, every leaf trembling as if caught in a shared secret. The warrior's eyes did not waver from the three men, yet there was a quietness about him, a stillness that spoke of patience honed through years of living with the land, reading its signs, knowing its dangers before they arrived. He had seen hunters, outlaws, and men driven by greed, but there was something different about these three. Their movements betrayed desperation more than malice, though desperation in such hands could be just as deadly. The woman tried to steady her breathing, though each inhale felt loud and intrusive in the heavy silence. She had come to the river to collect herbs and perhaps find a moment of peace away from the small settlement she had called home. That peace was gone, replaced by a fear that dug deep into her bones. And yet, with the warrior there was also a sliver of hope, fragile and unsteady, that she clung to because it was all she had. She could not read his mind, could not know whether he would intervene fully, or whether he was waiting for the right moment to act. Every instinct told her that he was in command of the moment, but instinct alone was not enough to calm the storm that churned around her. The three men shifted, uneasy now. The taller of them, a gaunt man with a jagged scar across his cheek, whispered something under his breath. The words were muffled, carried away by the breeze, but the tone was clear, fear mixed with frustration. Their previous confidence had dissolved, replaced by a tension that sharpened their every movement. And the smallest one, barely more than a boy, wrung his hands and looked at his companions as though seeking permission to retreat, yet the pride of survival held him in place. The third, broad-shouldered and silent, simply watched, muscles coiled, waiting for a signal he himself did not seem to fully understand. The warrior's presence brought more than just protection, it brought questions. The woman had never seen a man move with such unspoken authority, as though he could bend the world to his will without raising his voice. His dark eyes scanned not only the immediate threat, but the surrounding trees, the river's edge, the faint impressions of paths that crossed through the underbrush. Each movement was calculated, precise, as if he had been here before, or as if he could predict where each person would go next. There was a wisdom in him that spoke of survival far beyond the rules of the small settlement she knew. She wondered fleetingly who he was, and why he had appeared at this exact moment. The stories she had grown up hearing whispered of Apache warriors who roamed the land. Fierce and unyielding, but she had never truly believed them to be more than legend. And yet there he was, standing before her, an almost spectral figure drawn from the very wilderness. Could he be one of the warriors of those stories, a guardian of the forests and rivers, or merely a man who had mastered the art of survival? The uncertainty made her heart race, and she found herself wishing she could speak, though the sound of her own voice might draw more danger than it repelled. The taller man took a step forward, testing the boundary, but the warrior's shift was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight that stopped him in his tracks. It was not a threat of immediate violence, but a warning. A message carved into the stillness. Move wrong, and the consequences would be swift. The boy beside him gulped and glanced at the river, perhaps contemplating escape, but the current looked deeper than it was safe to cross, and the banks were slick. Fear rooted them all in place, and the river's gentle murmur now sounded like a watchful, knowing witness to the unfolding moment. She could feel the history in the land around Hertha, traces of countless travelers, settlers, and warriors who had passed this way. The river had carried whispers of struggle and survival, of people who had vanished in the forest, and those who had emerged changed, hardened, or haunted. It was as if the place itself remembered, and it held its breath alongside her. And in that memory, in the silent watch of the trees and the flowing water, she sensed that the warrior was not merely a protector, but a force tied to the river and the forest in ways that went beyond what she could comprehend. The boy's hand twitched, reaching toward the taller man, who shook his head sharply. They were testing one another, the three men, unsure of how far they could push, and yet unable to retreat. In that hesitation, the warrior seemed to grow larger, not in size but in presence, an immovable figure carved from the land itself. The woman caught herself staring at his hands, steady and ready, and at the quiet strength in his posture. He did not rush, did not panic, and it was that calm that made her realize how inexperienced the three men truly were in facing someone who lived in tune with the wilderness. Memories of the settlement flashed through her mind, the small cabins, the rough paths, the people who whispered of threats from the forest, but who had never truly ventured beyond the cleared fields. Here on the riverbank, all of that seemed distant and fragile. The forest had its own rules, its own guardians, and the warrior before her was living proof of that. There was an understanding in him, a knowledge of the land, its dangers, and its secrets, that no ordinary person could ever possess. And it was that understanding that created a tension thick enough to taste, holding everyone on the brink of motion, waiting for a spark that might ignite the next move. The broad-shouldered man, silent until now, shifted uneasily. His eyes darted from the warrior to the river, then to the woman, as if he was beginning to grasp that the balance of power had shifted. He had underestimated the situation, assuming that numbers and intimidation were enough, but he was learning, slowly and reluctantly, that courage and instinct were far more dangerous in the hands of someone who understood both the land and the human heart. The taller man muttered again, sharper this time, but the words seemed to falter against the quiet force that held the scene. She felt a sudden awareness of her own fragility, of how small and exposed she was. And yet, she also felt something else, a strange sense of being part of something larger, something beyond the reach of her ordinary life. The warrior's presence made the forest feel alive in a different way, as if every rustle of leaves, every ripple in the water, carried a message only he could read. And though the danger had not passed, and the threat was still immediate, there was a lesson in watching him. That courage was not loud, that strength was not always measured by force, and that survival depended as much on wisdom as it did on skill. The sun slipped lower, casting long shadows across the riverbank, and the light seemed to accentuate every movement, every subtle shift of posture. The woman's heart hammered in her chest, a rhythm that matched the tension in the air. She could hear the faint scrape of a boot against stone, the whisper of fabric brushing against bark, and each sound made her flinch. The warrior's gaze followed it all, unblinking, unshaken, yet not relaxed. He was patient, but there was an intensity there that spoke of readiness to act if the moment demanded it. A memory she could not place rose in her mind, stories of families taken by the wilderness, of men who vanished in pursuit of wealth or revenge, of travelers who ignored the warnings of those who knew the land. And in that memory she saw a warning mirrored in the faces of the three men. Desperation often led to recklessness, and recklessness in the wilderness had consequences far beyond the ordinary world. The warrior's presence reminded her that the forest was not merely a backdrop, but an active participant in every unfolding event. She tried to focus, to take in every detail, every shift in the men's movements, every glance exchanged between them. The scarred man's eyes narrowing as he calculated his options, the broad man's posture taut like a bowstring drawn too tight.
Ow.
And she realized, with a clarity that sent a shiver through her, that they were not just men driven by greed, they were men trapped by fear, by choices they could not undo, facing a force they could not comprehend. The warrior's eyes, dark and unyielding, flicked to her for a moment, just long enough to communicate an understanding, a silent acknowledgement that she was not to move until he gave some signal. The river flowed beside them, calm yet insistent, a reminder that life went on, indifferent to human conflict. The forest seemed to lean closer, the shadows stretching as the day waned, and the suspense hung thick in the air, a palpable weight that pressed down on every heart along the bank. The three men shifted again, slowly, carefully, testing boundaries that had suddenly become unclear. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that made each decision heavier, each step a gamble. And in that precarious balance, the forest held its breath, the river whispered its warnings. And the woman felt herself caught between fear and awe, caught in a moment that seemed poised on the edge of discovery or disaster. She knew that this encounter would mark her forever, though she could not yet understand how. And she knew, too, that the warrior before her held secrets of his own, a past intertwined with the land, the river, and the shadows that now surrounded them. The suspense lingered, unbroken, as the sun dipped closer to the horizon, leaving the riverbank bathed in dim golden light, and every heart on that bank waited for the moment when the balance would tip and the story would surge forward into the unknown. The forest grew darker as the sun slipped behind the distant ridges, leaving the riverbank shrouded in long shadows that stretched like fingers across the water. The woman could feel the tension vibrating through the ground, as though the trees themselves had leaned in to witness the standoff. She stayed rooted in place, trying to steady her racing thoughts while keeping her eyes on the warrior, whose calm presence seemed to anchor the moment. But even as he stood silent, the danger around her had not diminished. If anything, the fading light made every movement more uncertain, every shadow more threatening. The three men whispered among themselves now, their voices low, but edged with desperation. The taller man's voice carried a sharpness that suggested frustration, and she realized that their earlier confidence had turned into fear, a fear that did not leave much room for reason. The boy beside him trembled visibly, his hands brushing against the knife at his belt, though it was clear he had little skill with it. The broad man remained silent, muscles tense, watching the warrior like an animal sizing up a predator. The woman could sense their growing impatience, their urge to act before the mysterious man could fully assert his power. She remembered the stories her mother had told her as a child, tales of Apache warriors who could appear and vanish like shadows, men whose presence could silence a room or turn the tide of battle without a single word. She had always imagined them as legends, ghostly figures from a past long gone, but standing here. Seeing the controlled confidence of the man before her, she understood that the stories had not been exaggeration. There was a power in his patience, a strength that did not rely on violence, but on presence, and it made her both safe and nervous. Safe, because he was there. Nervous, because she had no idea what he was capable of, or what might provoke him to act. Her mind wandered briefly to the settlement she had left behind, to the small cabin she shared with an aging relative who had raised her after her parents passed. That life seemed distant now, like a faint memory of a different world. Here on the riverbank, surrounded by towering trees and the low hum of the river, the rules were different. Survival depended not on law or town ordinances, but on skill, instinct, and the ability to read people and land alike. She realized that her presence here had been an accident, a misstep into a world she had only glimpsed from afar, and yet somehow she had stumbled into the protection of someone who belonged to it fully. The tall man shifted, glancing at the river before turning his eyes back to the warrior. There was a glint of calculation in his gaze, a plan forming that he hoped would put him in control again. She saw the small movement of his hand toward his belt, and her pulse quickened, every muscle in her body tensing. The warrior's eyes followed the motion without flinching. There was a message in that gaze, quiet but unmistakable. Any foolish act would be met with immediate consequence. It was in that instant that she realized the stakes of this confrontation were higher than she had imagined. The three men were not merely opportunists. They were desperate men, and desperation could drive anyone to recklessness. The boy's hand shook as he reached again toward the knife, and she caught herself holding her breath, waiting for the inevitable clash that she knew could erupt at any moment. And yet, the warrior remained calm, a pillar of quiet strength in the growing twilight, as if the forest itself were lending him its patience. From a different angle, she began to notice the subtle details of the riverbank. The rocks, slick with moisture, could provide footing for someone to flee or maneuver. But they were treacherous, especially for those unfamiliar with the terrain. The underbrush near the trees offered cover, but not much room to move quickly. She understood now why the warrior had chosen this spot, why he had positioned himself as he had. The land itself became part of the standoff, a silent ally shaping every possible action. Each person's movement was constrained, and every choice carried weight, a misstep amplified by the river, the rocks, and the shadows. The woman's thoughts flicked to the boy. Despite his fear, there was something in him that suggested a rough resilience, a willingness to follow the taller man even when his instincts screamed against it. She wondered what had brought him to this point, what circumstances in life had left him here, caught in the shadow of men, far more experienced in danger than he was. Perhaps he had been driven by loyalty, or maybe by necessity, but now he was forced to face a test he had never imagined. She felt a pang of sympathy, even as she recognized that fear alone would not save him, nor would it keep the situation from spiraling further. Meanwhile, the warrior's gaze moved from the boy to the broad man, then back to the taller one. Each glance was careful, measured, but the woman could sense an unspoken assessment being made. A silent weighing of their intentions, their capabilities, and their weaknesses. He did not speak, yet his presence communicated volumes. The three men, for all their whispered strategizing, had begun to sense that the riverbank was no longer theirs to dominate. That realization brought a flicker of panic into their movements, subtle shifts in posture, the tightening of grips on weapons that were little more than symbols of control now. The forest seemed to respond to the tension, the wind stirring leaves, the river shifting in its flow. She noticed a bird overhead circling and then disappearing into the shadows, as if nature itself were attuned to the suspense on the ground. Every sense was heightened, the smell of wet earth, the rustle of underbrush, the cool bite of air against her skin. Time itself seemed suspended, stretching moments into eternity, and in that stretch, the woman felt the sharp awareness of her own vulnerability. A memory of her father came to her, a man who had taught her that courage was often silent, that strength was as much in restraint as in action. She had never truly understood it until now, watching the warrior. The contrast between the calculated calm of his stance and the erratic fear of the three men was stark. One small misstep, one rash action, and everything could ignite into violence. Yet he seemed unhurried, almost as if he had seen this before. Perhaps this was not the first time he had faced men who underestimated him, or women caught in impossible situations, or the delicate balance of life and death along a riverbank. From another perspective, she began to notice the subtle dynamics between the three men themselves. The taller one seemed to lead, but his authority was fragile, reliant on the boy's compliance and the broad man's silence. Each of them carried a weight of expectation, fear, and past mistakes that had brought them to this place. And in their hesitation, the woman saw the opening for the warrior. Though she also knew the risk, desperation can drive men to sudden, violent acts that no calm presence could always prevent. She caught her breath as the taller man made another subtle movement, leaning slightly toward the river. The warrior's gaze followed, a shadow of recognition passing over his features. He shifted just enough, a quiet warning that spoke of readiness without aggression. And then, for a fleeting moment, the woman glimpsed a flash of something deeper history in his eyes, perhaps or a personal code that guided every decision. She could not know what had brought him to this riverbank, why he had appeared at this exact moment, but she felt certain that his presence was no accident, that it was part of something larger than she could yet understand. The boy took a hesitant step back, the taller man's hand falling slightly, uncertain. The broad man, still silent, glanced around, sensing the change, the invisible boundary that the warrior's presence had drawn. And she realized that the three men were beginning to feel the pressure, not just from one man, but from the land itself. From the river and trees, from a force that moved in subtle, controlled ways. She could hear her own heartbeat now, a steady drum in her ears, and she felt the tension knotting her stomach. She was trapped between fear and awe, between the danger posed by the men and the uncertain protection of the warrior. Every step, every choice, every glance mattered, and the forest, the river, the shadows, and the fading light all combined to create a stage where the next move could determine survival, escape, or disaster. As the last slivers of sunlight disappeared behind the ridges, the air grew colder, heavier with anticipation. The river whispered along its banks, and the forest seemed to exhale, holding its breath with them. The woman felt a strange mix of dread and resolve. She had no plan, no skill in confronting such danger, yet she understood that she was now part of something larger. A story unfolding with consequences that would ripple far beyond this riverbank. And then, as the first stars began to pierce the evening sky, the taller man made a sound, almost a challenge, almost a signal. The warrior's gaze sharpened, dark eyes fixed on the motion with a precision that promised immediate response. The boy froze, the broad man tensed, and the woman's chest tightened. The moment had shifted, the balance delicate and dangerous, and the suspense wrapped around them like the shadows of the trees. Every instinct screamed that something was about to happen, something that would change the course of the night, the riverbank, and the lives of everyone there. And yet nothing had yet erupted. The danger remained suspended, the conflict unresolved, and the forest itself seemed to lean closer. Listening, waiting, as the story teetered on the edge of the unknown, the river's surface had darkened into a mirror of black and silver. Reflecting the first hints of moonlight that slipped past the thick canopy of the forest, every sound seemed amplified, now the rustle of leaves, the soft scrape of a boot against stone, the occasional snap of a twig. The woman's pulse raced as she remained frozen near the water's edge, her fingers clenched around a loose piece of driftwood more for comfort than defense. The three men were closer now, their whispered words sharp with urgency, and the warrior had shifted slightly, positioning himself to block any sudden advance. The tension between them had thickened into something almost visible, a wire stretched taut over the riverbank. The tall man's eyes darted nervously to the boy, and she noticed the silent communication between them, a desperate coordination born from fear. Yet their planning felt fragile, brittle, easily shattered by a single miscalculation. The broad man's shoulders tensed, and she could see the faint tremor in his hands. The woman sensed that while all three had come to the river with intent, none of them had anticipated the presence of someone like the warrior. The air itself seemed charged with the unspoken knowledge that the stakes had risen beyond their understanding. The warrior's gaze swept across the riverbank, taking in every detail. He did not speak, yet the sheer force of his presence was enough to shift the energy of the three men. It was a quiet command, a warning that they were outmatched, not merely in skill, but in perception. In the awareness of the land and of each other, the woman felt her body shiver as she realized that this was a man who could see danger before it arrived, who could anticipate the movements of those who thought themselves in control. And yet he remained patient, a coiled force waiting for the right instant, while the three men grew more uneasy with each passing second. The boy's lips quivered, and she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had been counting on the taller man's confidence to guide him, but now that confidence was faltering, replaced by tension and misgivings. The broad man, who had been silent throughout, shifted his stance as though readying himself for action he was not fully sure he could take. Every subtle movement seemed amplified in the stillness, each breath a drumbeat echoing through the forest. The woman felt as though the riverbank had become a stage for something older and larger than herself, a confrontation that belonged to the land, the river, and the shadows alike. Her mind turned briefly to the past, to the story she had grown up with, 2 whispers of Apache warriors who moved like shadows and defended the land with unyielding resolve. She had never imagined that such a figure could appear in her life. Yet here he stood, calm and controlled, embodying every story she had ever heard. She realized that his presence alone had shifted the balance, yet she also understood that the danger had not passed. The men still carried intent in their movements, and desperation often makes the unpredictable most dangerous. The wind stirred through the trees, carrying with it a scent of wet earth and the faint smoke of distant fires. The forest seemed alive with anticipation, as if it recognized the approaching climax of the night's events. The warrior's eyes flicked briefly toward her, and she understood the silent message. Stay calm, stay low, wait. One wrong move could trigger violence that neither side could fully control. She felt a chill run down her spine, a mixture of fear and awe, and realized that she had been thrust into the center of a story far larger than she had imagined. The taller man stepped forward, a tentative move meant to assert authority. But the warrior's subtle shift caused him to hesitate. It was almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. One false step, and the consequences would be immediate. The boy's hand brushed against his knife again, and she caught her breath, sensing the moment teetering on the edge of chaos. The broad man's eyes flicked from the warrior to the river, then back again, muscles coiled, waiting for a signal he did not yet fully understand. Each of them was trapped in the suspense, their own fear amplifying the danger they had brought upon themselves. She could feel the rhythm of the river, its steady murmur a counterpoint to the rising tension. The water moved inexorably forward, a reminder that time continued even as the night seemed to stretch, suspended in suspense. She noticed the warrior's fingers lightly brushing the hilt of his weapon, not in threat, but in readiness. There was an understanding in that gesture, a message that he could act at any instant, yet chose restraint, heightening the uncertainty, making every heartbeat count. The forest itself seemed to respond to the growing suspense. The shadows lengthened, stretched by the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy. And the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the rustle of a small animal, the distant hoot of an owl, became sharper, more pronounced, adding layers to the tension that gripped the riverbank. The woman's eyes darted between the warrior and the 3 men, noting every micro-movement, every subtle shift in stance, understanding instinctively that survival depended on reading these signs accurately. The tall man muttered again, sharper this time, and she could sense the tension within him fraying further. His leadership was unraveling under the pressure of the warrior's presence. The boy flinched at the sound, his fear growing with every whispered word. The broad man shifted, uncertain, a silent threat to both his companions and the warrior. And in that triangle of tension, the woman realized how fragile their situation had become. One action, one misjudged movement, could ignite the danger fully, and the riverbank would become a place of chaos and violence. Her mind traced back to the warrior, wondering how he had come to know the rhythms of the land so intimately, how he could remain calm in the face of such obvious danger. There was history in his eyes, perhaps battles fought in shadows, perhaps losses carried silently. She sensed that he was not merely acting in the moment, but responding to something deeper, something that tied him to the forest, to the river, and perhaps to her fate, in ways she could not yet understand. The boy's foot slid slightly on the slick ground, and the tall man swore under his breath. The broad man's posture tightened, ready for action. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as the first sparks of real movement began to flicker. The warrior shifted his weight, a deliberate, measured motion that seemed to compress the air around him. His eyes met the tallest man's, and in that gaze the woman felt an unspoken warning. Any aggression would be met instantly, decisively, with skill born of experience and instinct, honed in the wilderness. The river's current pressed at the shore, a low, insistent sound that seemed to echo the rising tension. Every leaf, every stone, every shadow became part of the unfolding drama. She could see the boy's hesitation, the silent plea in his eyes for guidance or escape. The taller man's hands twitched, searching for control over a situation slipping beyond his grasp. The broad man's stance radiated potential energy, ready to explode. And through it all, the warrior remained poised, a silent force commanding the scene, waiting for the instant that would demand action. The forest grew quieter, the animals retreating into hidden corners, the wind pausing as if holding its breath. The woman felt the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders, heavy with anticipation. Every instinct screamed that the climax was near, that the night's tension was about to shatter into motion. She watched the three men, their desperation becoming palpable, their fear sharpened by the invisible boundary the warrior had drawn. A single misstep, a sudden lunge, a whispered threat could ignite everything. The warrior's calmness made the suspense almost unbearable, every second stretching into eternity. The woman clenched the driftwood tighter, her knuckles white, feeling the river's current whisper warnings along her skin. Every sense was heightened, the faint scent of smoke, the chill of the evening air, the creak of branches under unseen weight. The boy shifted again, uncertain, and the taller man reached for his knife, hesitation etched into every motion. The broad man's eyes flicked between the two, ready to act but unsure which path to take. And the warrior's gaze followed every movement, dark and unflinching, a force that promised consequence without sound, a power that demanded respect. The riverbank had become a stage, the forest a silent witness, and the night held its breath as the story approached the edge of eruption. The woman's mind raced. She could feel her pulse in her ears, could sense the electricity in the air as every person waited for the signal, for the moment that would tip the balance.
Oh.
The shadows seemed to grow deeper, the river more insistent, as though the land itself understood the climax was approaching.
Ow.
She realized that she was on the edge of something immense, something that would test courage, skill, and instinct in ways she could not yet imagine. And then, the tall man's hand moved faster than before, a flash of intent, and the riverbank held its collective breath. The boy froze, the broad man's muscles tensed, and the warrior's posture shifted subtly, preparing for action. The woman's heart pounded, each beat echoing like a drum of suspense as the moment stretched to its breaking point. Every second felt like an eternity, every glance a warning, every shadow a threat. The night hung over the riverbank like a heavy curtain, the moonlight glinting off the water, the trees whispering in the wind. The story teetered on the edge of chaos, the conflicts converging, the danger at its peak. The warrior stood ready, the three men poised in desperation, and the woman, caught between fear and awe, realized that the next moment would decide everything. The suspense was absolute, the climax imminent, and the riverbank held the secrets of what was about to unfold. The tall man's hand froze mid-motion, caught in the invisible weight of the warrior's gaze. Time seemed to pause along the riverbank, the only sound the low rush of the river and the distant whisper of the wind through the trees. Then, without warning, the warrior moved, but not with the speed of anger or aggression. Its motion was deliberate, precise, a shift that sent a ripple of understanding through the three men. They stumbled back instinctively, their confidence shattered by the quiet authority he exuded. The woman could hardly breathe as she watched the scene unfold, every heartbeat stretched to the limit. The broad man grunted, realizing too late that force alone would not carry him through this moment. He dropped his knife with a clatter against the stones, a sound that seemed loud in the heavy silence. The boy stepped back, trembling, eyes wide with fear and relief as he followed his lead. The tall man, the one who had seemed the most in control moments before, froze, staring at the warrior as though seeing him for the first time. The air itself seemed to hum with the tension breaking, the storm of conflict finally finding its pause. The warrior did not advance further. He simply stood, unwavering, letting the men retreat, letting the lessons sink in. His presence alone had resolved the immediate threat without a single blow, without a word, and the woman realized that this was the true measure of his strength. It was not in violence, but in mastery over himself, over the land, and over those who would disturb its balance. The three men backed away, glancing at one another, unsure whether to run entirely or merely step cautiously from the riverbank. Their confidence had been replaced by something heavier, a fear that would follow them far beyond this forest. The woman exhaled slowly, feeling her body relax for the first time in what felt like hours. Her hands unclenched, though they still trembled from the tension of waiting. The river's steady murmur returned to her senses, grounding her. A reminder that the world went on even after the storm of suspense had passed. She looked at the warrior, really looked at him, and for the first time allowed herself to see the full depth of his presence, the quiet intensity of his eyes, the careful strength in his posture, the silent command over the land around them. He was more than a protector. He was a part of the riverbank, the forest, the wind, a living force that belonged to the wilderness. Are you hurt?" she asked softly, her voice trembling, though he did not flinch at its sound. He shook his head slightly, a small gesture that was all the answer she needed. There had been no need for confrontation beyond the warning. No blood spilled, and yet the lesson had been delivered with absolute clarity. She realized then that courage and patience often outweighed force, and that in the quiet moments, the true power of a warrior, revealed itself most clearly. The three men had moved several paces back, their movements uncertain, the night swallowing them as they fled through the shadows. The woman felt a mixture of relief and awe knowing that the danger had passed, but understanding also that the forest did not forget easily. She glanced at the river, the water flowing endlessly onward, carrying away not just the echoes of fear, but the memory of what had been learned. That strength could be quiet, patience could be powerful, and respect for the land and its guardians was never optional. The warrior turned his gaze toward her, and for the first time, she noticed the faint scars along his hands and forearms, marks that spoke of survival, of hardship, of battles fought long before she had ever set foot in the forest. There was a story in him, one that went deeper than the immediate danger, and she sensed that she had been allowed a glimpse of a world she might never fully understand. Yet she also felt honored, privileged to witness the measure of a life lived in harmony with the land, in balance with its dangers, and guided by a code that transcended fear or violence. She took a cautious step forward, toward him, and he did not retreat. Instead, he watched her eyes steady, unyielding, yet not unkind. She could feel the connection forged in the tension of the past hours, the shared understanding that life was fragile, that courage mattered, and that in moments of danger, the choices of a single person could alter the course of many lives. "You saved me," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. He gave a small nod, no more words than necessary. Actions, she realized, had spoken louder than any explanation ever could. The night held them both quiet now, the only sound the river and the distant call of a lone owl. Shadows softened as the moon rose higher, silvering the water and the forest in a gentle, forgiving light. The woman felt a sense of closure, though the events would remain etched in her memory forever. She understood that life in the settlement, in the ordinary world, might seem distant now, yet it had been shaped by the lessons she had learned on the riverbank. Bravery, patience, and respect were as vital as the air she breathed. The warrior gestured toward the path leading back through the trees. She followed, stepping lightly, feeling the cool earth beneath her boots and the pulse of the forest in her chest. They walked together, silently, each absorbed in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. The river flowed beside them, constant and unwavering, as though marking the passage of danger and relief alike. She felt the rhythm of survival in every step, the enduring truth that life moved forward, even after moments that seemed eternal. As they neared the edge of the forest, the woman thought about the three men now gone into the night. Their threat had been real, yet they had been overcome not by force alone, but by wisdom, presence, and the connection one man had with the land itself. She reflected on the idea that courage was not always visible, that true strength often existed quietly, waiting for the precise moment to assert itself. The warrior had taught her that lesson without words, and it left a lasting impression on her mind and spirit. The river's murmur faded slightly as they emerged from the denser trees, the open sky stretching above them. She could see the settlement lights twinkling in the distance, welcoming and ordinary after the extraordinary events of the riverbank. The woman felt a mixture of relief and transformation, knowing that her life had been forever altered. She would carry the memory of this night, the river, the forest, and the warrior with her always, a reminder of the power of patience, presence, and courage. Finally, the warrior stopped near the edge of the clearing, turning to look at her one last time. There was a solemnity in his gaze, a recognition that their paths had crossed for a purpose, that some lessons were meant to be learned and remembered. She nodded, understanding more than words could say, grateful for the protection, the guidance, and the silent strength he had offered. With that, he disappeared into the shadows of the forest, as if he had been a part of the land all along. She stood for a moment, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the river, feeling a sense of peace she had not known since the sun had begun to set. The three men were gone, the danger resolved, and yet the lessons remained etched deep within her, She realized that life was a delicate balance, that courage could appear in unexpected forms, and that sometimes survival depended as much on understanding the world around you as on the choices you made within it. The woman turned toward the settlement, the lights flickering like small promises against the darkening horizon. Her steps were lighter now, though each one carried the weight of the night's experience. She felt stronger, more aware, more connected to the world around her and the lessons that it offered. She knew that the river, the forest, and the warrior's presence would remain with her, a guiding memory of resilience and the quiet power of standing firm when danger approached. As she reached the edge of the first clearing, she paused, looking back at the forest, at the riverbank where the confrontation had taken place. The moonlight shimmered on the water, and the night held the echoes of the tension that had once gripped it. She smiled faintly, realizing that although fear had been present, courage had triumphed in loudness, not in recklessness, but in quiet, deliberate action. She felt a profound respect for the land and for the lessons it had allowed her to witness, and she knew that those lessons would shape every step she took moving forward. The river continued to flow, indifferent yet constant, carrying away the echoes of the night. The woman walked toward her home, the forest behind her, and the memory of the warrior etched firmly in her mind. The night had tested her, had pushed her to the edge of fear and uncertainty, yet it had also offered her insight, protection, and understanding. She felt the weight of gratitude, the thrill of survival, and the quiet awe of witnessing someone who embodied the very spirit of the land itself. By the time she reached the edge of the settlement, the first signs of dawn were brushing the sky with pale light. She paused, breathing in the crisp morning air, and felt a sense of closure and renewal. The threats of the riverbank had been resolved, the lessons learned, and yet the night remained alive in memory, a story she would carry forever. She understood that courage, patience, and connection to the world around her were the true measures of survival, and she knew that those lessons would guide her in all the days to come. The woman stepped into the settlement, the lights welcoming her back, the air carrying the faint scent of morning dew. She paused once more, looking back toward the forest and the river, and whispered a silent thank you to the warrior who had appeared when she needed him most. Though he had vanished, his presence lingered, a reminder of the quiet power that exists in patience, awareness, and courage. The night had tested her, and she had emerged changed. The river continued to flow, the forest stood watch, and the memory of the warrior remained, permanent echo of bravery, wisdom, and the enduring strength of one who moves through the world with purpose and presence. She stepped fully into the light of the settlement, carrying the lessons of the riverbank with her, ready to face whatever the world might bring next.